It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and the faint hum of lawnmowers filled the air. It was the kind of morning that made you want to sit on your porch with a cup of coffee and watch the world wake up. But for me, Jake Thompson, that peace was about to be shattered. I had lived in Willow Creek for 5 years, and for the most part, it was a pleasant place to call home. The houses were well kept, the streets were clean, and the neighbors were friendly except for one. Her name was Margaret Hargrove, the self-proclaimed Queen of Willow Creek and the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Margaret was the kind of person who thrived on control. She had a ruler for your grass, a color chart for your shutters, and a fine for every little infraction she could dream up. She was the embodiment of suburban tyranny, and she had made my life a levying hell. It wasn't always like this. When I first moved in, I thought the HOA was a good thing. They kept the neighborhood looking nice, and I didn't mind following a few rules. But Margaret took it to a whole new level. She measured the height of my hedges, complained about the color of my mailbox, and even fined me for levying my garbage cans out 5 minutes too long. It was ridiculous, but I tried to keep the peace. That was until the day she parked her brand new Lexus SUV across my driveway. I remember the moment VY delay. I was standing in my kitchen, sipping my morning coffee, when I noticed something odd outside. My driveway was blocked by a shiny black Lexus. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had parked there temporarily. But as I stepped outside, I saw Margaret standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, wearing that smug grin she reserved for moments when she was about to ruin someone's day. "Morning, Margaret," I said, trying to keep my tone civil. "Your car's blocking my driveway." She didn't even flinch. "Oh, I know," she replied sweetly, as if she were discussing the weather. "It's HOA business. We've had some complaints about your driveway." I blinked, confused. "Complaints? From who?" "That's confidential," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "But we've decided your driveway doesn't comply with HOA standards." I looked at my driveway. It was a perfectly normal concrete slab, nothing fancy, but certainly not breaking any rules. "That's ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with it." Margaret inspected her nails, feigning disinterest. "Well, unfortunately, the HOA board has the final say. Until we conduct a proper review, I'll need to keep my vehicle here to prevent further infractions." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "You're joking, right?" "Nope," she chirped, pulling out a clipboard and scribbling something down. "Oh, and I should mention if you try to tow my car, that'll be considered harassment. HOA rules." I wanted to argue, to yell, to do something, but I knew Margaret. She thrived on confrontation. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could slap me with more fines and complaints. So instead, I took a deep breath, nodded, and walked back inside. The next few days were hell. Every morning, I woke up to find Margaret's car still blocking my driveway. The HOA refused to help, and when I called a tow company, they refused, citing some vague community agreement. Meanwhile, Margaret acted like she had won the lottery, strutting around like she owned my property. Then came the fines. Apparently, I was now being penalized for neglecting driveway maintenance. According to the HOA, my failure to use my driveway because, it was blocked was grounds for an infraction. Every time I checked my mailbox, there was a fresh letter demanding payment. It was infuriating, but I wasn't the kind of guy to just roll over and take it. If Margaret wanted to play dirty, I'd play smart. I spent the next few nights doing what I did best, research. If the HOA was going to weaponize its rules, I was going to find my own legal loophole. And after hours of digging through zoning laws and property codes, I found a single line in the local ordinances that changed everything. It turned out there were no regulations against making security modifications to private property, as long as they weren't permanent structures. That meant I could legally build a barrier around my driveway. I double-checked, triple-checked, and even called a lawyer friend to confirm. It was airtight, and that's when the real fun began. The next day, I rented an excavator. I hired a few guys from a construction crew and told them I wanted a deep, wide trench around my driveway, not a little ditch, but a full-on medieval-style moat. They thought I was crazy, but hey, money talks. By the time the sun set, my driveway was surrounded by a 4-foot-deep trench, wide enough that no car could cross it. The next morning, Margaret stormed over, ready to gloat. But the moment she saw her Lexus stranded in the middle of the trench, her expression went from smug to sheer horror. "What the hell is this?" she screeched. "Oh, just some security modifications," I said, barely suppressing my grin. "HOA rules say I can do it." Margaret's eye twitched. "You can't just dig a hole around my car." "Sure I can," I said. "You see, this is my property, and since you refuse to move, well, I had no choice but to build around you." She looked like her brain was short-circuiting. You can't. This is illegal." "Nope," I said, pulling out a printout of the zoning laws. "Totally legal. In fact, I even filed a permit. City approved." Margaret's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. "You're going to regret this," she spat. "The HOA will not allow this." I shrugged. "Guess we'll see." I walked back inside, Leah VYing her standing there, fuming. The best part? I wasn't done yet. The trench was just the beginning. If Margaret thought this was over, she was in for the shock of her life. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of furious banging on my front door. I already knew who it was before I even checked the peephole. Margaret was standing there, looking like she had spent the night plotting my destruction. Her face was red, her fists clenched, and the moment I opened the door, she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "You need to fill that hole in right now," she seethed. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the way her eye twitched at my lack of urgency. "Oh, you mean the trench? Sorry, can't do that. It's a legal security measure." Margaret let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a screech. "You have exactly 24 hours to fix this, or I will make sure the HOA fines you into oblivion." I pretended to think about it. "You know, that's interesting, because I was about to make some more improvements." She narrowed her eyes. "What kind of improvements?" I grinned. "A drawbridge." Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping for air. She looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "You can't just put a drawbridge in a suburban neighborhood." "Sure I can," I said. "I already checked the regulations. As long as it's a temporary structure and not a permanent gate, I can build it. And since you're so concerned about my driveway, this will help keep it protected." Margaret looked like she wanted to throw something at me, but instead, she stormed off, muttering threats about city inspectors, lawsuits, and how I was going to regret this. I had no doubt she was going to do everything in her power to shut me down, but I wasn't worried. I had done my homework, and for once, I was actually looking forward to this battle. I spent the next few days gathering materials and hiring a few skilled contractors. The best part was that I didn't even need anything fancy, just some reinforced wood, strong metal hinges, and a pulley system to make it work. I made sure to record every step of the process, not just for proof that I was following regulations, but because I had a feeling this was going to be internet gold. As construction continued, Margaret escalated. She called in city inspectors, who came by expecting to shut me down, but left shaking their heads when they saw that everything was perfectly legal. She tried to organize a petition with the other homeowners, but most of them were just as sick of her as I was. She even went as far as trying to block my contractors from entering the neighborhood, but that backfired when one of them turned out to be the brother of a city councilman. By the time the drawbridge was fully installed, the whole neighborhood was watching. It was a thing of beauty, a sturdy wooden platform controlled by a simple pulley system that allowed me to raise and lower it whenever I pleased. I gave it a test run, pulling the rope and watching with satisfaction as the bridge lifted, Leah VYing my driveway completely inaccessible. Margaret, of course, lost her mind. "This is insane. You can't have a medieval fortress in the middle of the neighborhood," she screamed. "It's not a fortress," I said. "It's a security feature. You know, for protecting my property. HOA rules encourage security improvements." She let out a strangled noise and stomped away. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Later that night, I was woken up by the sound of rustling outside. I peeked through my blinds and saw Margaret creeping around the edge of my trench with a flashlight. She was inspecting the drawbridge, probably looking for a way to sabotage it. I grabbed my phone and started recording. "Looking for something, Margaret?" I called out. She whirled around, nearly losing her balance. "I was just making sure this ridiculous thing isn't a hazard." "You mean trespassing?" I said. "Because that's what it looks like to me." She scowled but quickly composed herself. "I'm on the HOA board. I have the right to inspect potential violations. That's funny, because last time I checked, the HOA doesn't own my property, I said. But don't worry, I'll be sending this video to my lawyer and maybe even posting it online. I'm sure the internet would love to see the HOA president sneaking around private property in the middle of the night. Her face drained of color, and without another word, she turned and hurried back to her house. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had spread about Margaret's midnight snooping, and people were starting to turn against her. She tried to spin it, claiming she was just doing her job, but no one was buying it. Meanwhile, my story was gaining traction online. The video of the trench and drawbridge had gone viral, with thousands of comments praising me for standing up to HOA tyranny. Margaret must have realized she was losing ground because she switched tactics. If she couldn't beat me with rules, she was going to make my life miserable in other ways. The fines kept coming, ridiculous ones, like unauthorized modifications to property and creating an unsightly structure. She even and set a few of her remaining HOA loyalists to file noise complaints, despite the fact that construction had already ended. But I was ready for her. I had been quietly gathering evidence of her abuse of power, including records of her misusing HOA funds for personal expenses. It wasn't hard to find, turns out. She wasn't nearly as careful with paperwork as she was with enforcing her petty rules. I compiled everything into a neat little folder, ready to strike when the time was right. The final showdown came during an emergency HOA meeting that Margaret had called to discuss my so-called violations. The moment I walked in, I could tell she thought she had won. She sat at the head of the table with a smug smile, ready to deliver her verdict. "We've decided that your modifications are in violation of the community standards," she announced. "You'll need to remove them immediately, or you will be facing legal action." I smiled, pulling out my folder and placing it on the table. "That's interesting, because I've found some violations of my own." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and started listing her misdeeds: fraudulent fines, misuse of HOA funds, intimidation tactics against homeowners. The more I read, the paler she got. "You're lying," she hissed. "I have proof," I said, "and I'm willing to take this to the authorities." Silence filled the room. The other board members, most of whom had been too scared to stand up to her before, suddenly looked very interested in what I had to say. Within minutes, Margaret was voted out as HOA president. By the end of the week, an investigation into her shady dealings had begun. That night, I stood on my driveway, sipping a cold drink as I watched Margaret's Lexus finally being towed away, not by me, but by the authorities. My trench and drawbridge had started as a joke, but in the end, they had been the perfect way to expose her corruption. And the best part? My driveway had never looked better. Margaret was quiet for a few days after the HOA meeting, which was unsettling in itself. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I knew she was brewing something. The neighborhood was still buzzing from her downfall, and people had started treating me like some kind of local legend. Every time I stepped outside, someone would wave, give me a thumbs up, or ask if they could see the drawbridge in action. Even the mailman had a good laugh about it. But I knew it wasn't over. Margaret wasn't going to let this go. Sure enough, the storm came. It started smell a sudden anonymous report to the city about unpermitted construction, a surprise inspection from a zoning official who looked both amused and annoyed when he saw my drawbridge. He shrugged, gave me a nod, and left after confirming that I was in the clear. Then came the fake complaints from neighbors, loud noises in the middle of the night, suspicious activity, even claims that my trench was a safety hazard that could cause structural instability in the neighborhood. I knew exactly who was behind it, but without solid proof, it was just another game of harassment. Then Margaret took it up a notch. One night, I woke up to a loud crash. My heart pounded as I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. At first, I didn't see anything, but when I turned on the outdoor lights, my stomach dropped. Someone had cut the ropes to my drawbridge. It lay half-collapsed into the trench, the wooden planks cracked from the impact. I grabbed my phone and checked the security cameras. There she was, Margaret, wearing all black like some kind of low-budget ninja, holding a pair of bolt cutters. She had actually climbed into my trench and cut the mechanism herself. I didn't even hesitate. I called the police. By the time the police arrived, Margaret had already fled back to her house, but the footage was all the EVY they needed. The officers knocked on her door, and after a tense few minutes, she was dragged outside, still screaming about how she was being harassed and targeted. She tried to spin the story, claiming she was preventing a neighborhood hazard, but the cops weren't buying it. They arrested her for trespassing and property damage. Watching her being handcuffed and stuffed into the back of a police cruiser was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. The neighborhood exploded with gossip the next day. It turned out Margaret had been pissing off people for years, but no one had dared to stand up to her until now. Some neighbors admitted they had wanted to fight back, but were afraid of retaliation. Now that she had been publicly humiliated, the HOA board had no choice but to take action. They held an emergency vote to remove her from the HOA entirely, stripping her of any remaining power. It was a unanimous decision. But that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, I received an email from an investigator handling HOA fraud cases. Apparently, Margaret's financial misdeeds had caught the attention of the authorities. They wanted to interview me about the files I had presented during the meeting. I handed over every fine she had wrongfully issued, every shady financial transaction I had uncovered. Within a week, the investigation turned into a full-blown legal case. Margaret wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a full-on scam artist. She had been skimming HOA funds for years, using them to fund personal vacations, luxury purchases, and even some suspicious offshore accounts. When the news broke, the neighborhood lost its mind. People who had once feared her were now openly mocking her. Some even put up "free at last" banners on their houses. Her house went up for sale shortly after. It sat on the market longer than usual because, well, no one wanted to buy the former dictator's residence. Eventually, she had no choice but to sell at a loss and leave town. The day she moved out, I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching as she loaded the last of her things into a MOVing truck. She shot me one last glare, but there was no power behind it anymore. She had lost. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast as the truck pulled away. With Margaret gone, the HOA board crumbled. Most of the remaining members resigned, and the neighborhood voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Turns out, people were happier without it. No more ridiculous rules, no more fines, no more fear of stepping out of line. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. As for me, I became a local legend. The story of the trench and drawbridge spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets picked it up, and before I knew it, I was being interviewed about my brilliant act of defiance. My videos went viral, and people from all over the world wanted to know more. Some even sent fan mail, asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA nightmares. The drawbridge, now fully repaired, became a permanent feature. Kids in the neighborhood loved it, calling my house Castle Jake. I even installed a small plaque at the edge of the trench that read, "In memory of HOA tyranny." It made for a great conversation piece. One evening, as I was grilling steaks in my backyard, one of my neighbors stopped by. He was an older guy, had lived here longer than anyone, and had seen Margaret's reign from the beginning. "You know," he said, watching the sun set over the now peaceful neighborhood, "I always thought someone would take her down eventually. But I never imagined it would happen with a trench and a drawbridge." I laughed. "Sometimes, you have to get creative." He grinned. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. This place is better without her." I nodded, flipping the steaks. "Yeah, it is. And for the first time since I moved in, I actually felt at home." If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.